6 months passed, and the galaxy moved on. Or at least it tried to. The first signs of trouble were small. They showed up in reports that nobody important was reading, in maintenance requests that sat unanswered in queues, in conversations between low-ranking technicians who scratched their heads and said things like, "I think the human used to handle this part." On the jungle world of Orathan IV, deep in Kreeth territory, a research outpost sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick green forests that never stopped growing. The outpost studied the atmosphere of the planet, which was rich and complex, and full of chemical compounds that could be useful in medicine and manufacturing. The atmospheric scrubbers that kept the outpost livable were a joint design. Kreeth engineers had built the frame, but a human environmental scientist named Katie Morgan had designed the filtration core and written the software that kept it adapting to the planet's constantly shifting air chemistry. Katie had lived on Orathan IV for 11 years. She had liked it there. She had kept a small garden outside her quarters and had learned to cook 3 Kreeth dishes that she was very proud of. When the recall order came, she had packed her things, handed her maintenance logs to the station chief, and left. Now, 6 months later, the filtration system failed. Not all at once, but in a slow, choking way. The air inside the outpost grew thick and sharp. The Kreeth engineers opened Katie's logs and found detailed instructions, but the instructions assumed a level of familiarity with the system that they did not have. Katie had written notes in the margins like, "If the third valve sticks, tap it twice and recalibrate from panel 6. The kind of knowledge that lived in a person's hands, not in a manual. The Kreeth sent a request to the Council for technical help. The Council's engineering corps reviewed the request, assigned it a priority level, and dispatched a team. The team arrived 4 months later. By then, half the outpost had been evacuated, and 2 years of atmospheric research data had been lost. Katie Morgan would have fixed the whole thing in a weekend. On the border of Fenori space, things were worse. The Fenori were a peaceful species. They were traders and scholars, not fighters. Their cargo ships moved along trade lanes that stretched across 3 sectors, carrying goods and knowledge between dozens of worlds. For the past 30 years, those trade lanes had been protected by human patrol corvettes, small, fast ships crewed by volunteers from Earth's Merchant Marine Academy. The corvettes ran escort missions free of charge. It was not a formal military arrangement. It was just something humans did because they saw a need and decided to fill it. The corvettes were gone now, and the pirates from the outer verge, who had always been out there, lurking and waiting, noticed almost immediately. In 6 months, pirate raids on Fenori shipping increased by 300%. Cargo was stolen, ships were damaged, crews were hurt. The Fenori trade guilds, who had never needed to think about security before, found themselves suddenly vulnerable in a way that frightened them. They petitioned the Galactic Council for a military escort force. The request went to the Baltari, who commanded the largest fleet in the council. The Baltari reviewed the petition and declined. A Baltari admiral sent back a single-line response. "Fenori trade lanes are not in our sector of responsibility." The Fenori had no military of their own. They had never needed one. They began losing money, and then they began losing people. But the worst crisis was the quietest one, and it was happening on Baltari Prime itself. The Galactic Medical Cooperative was the Council's proudest achievement, a shared network of hospitals, research labs, and training centers that served all member species. Humans had made up only 4% of its staff. It was a number that made it easy to dismiss them. 4%, hardly worth counting. But that 4% had produced nearly 40% of the cooperative's new research in the last 2 decades. Humans, it turned out, had a strange gift for medical innovation. They asked questions that other species considered foolish, and then they found answers that other species had never imagined. The clearest example was a drug called varicillin. It had been developed by a human pharmacologist named Sam Griffin, a quiet man from a small town in Ohio who had somehow ended up running a tiny lab on the 63rd floor of a research tower on Baltari Prime. Sam had spent 12 years working on a treatment for crimson wasting, a disease that attacked the nervous systems of young Baltari and killed thousands of children every year. The Baltari had been trying to cure it for centuries. Sam found the answer in 3 years and spent the next 9 refining it. He gave the formula away for free. He refused payment, refused credit, refused everything except a small office and enough funding to keep working. He had been training a team of Baltari researchers to produce the drug independently when the recall order came. He left before the training was finished. He was not happy about it. He had argued with the State Department for 2 weeks, asking for an extension, asking to be classified as a civilian exception. The answer was no. The withdrawal was complete. No exceptions. The Baltari researchers he left behind were talented and dedicated, but they could not replicate the final synthesis step. There was something in the process, a timing, a temperature shift, a small adjustment that Sam made by instinct after years of practice, that they could not figure out from his notes alone. They tried for months. They failed. The existing supply of vericillin began to run out, and on Baltari Prime, children began to die again. The council did not talk about this. It was not discussed in formal sessions or mentioned in official reports. It was a quiet tragedy, happening in hospitals far from the bright lights of the Grand Assembly Hall. But someone was paying attention. His name was Korath Sel, and he was a young Delvari junior diplomat assigned to the council's administrative office. He was not important. He had a small desk in a shared office and a title that meant almost nothing. But he was careful, and he was curious, and he had a habit of reading the reports that nobody else bothered to read. He started compiling data. He pulled maintenance logs, trade reports, medical output statistics, military readiness assessments, and communication network performance records. He cross-referenced everything with the date of the human withdrawal. He built a document that he called privately the Dependency Gap Report. The numbers told a story that nobody wanted to hear. In just 6 months, the council had begun to fray in dozens of small ways, and almost every thread led back to something a human had been doing quietly, without recognition, without thanks, and without anyone noticing until it stopped. Korath Sel brought a preliminary version of his report to his supervisor, a senior Delvari official named Thos Olin. Thos read it, frowned, and told Korath to stop. "This is not useful," Thos said. "The decision has been made. There is no value in looking backward." Korath returned to his small desk. He sat there for a long time, looking at the data on his screen. Then he kept working. He did not stop because he could not stop. The numbers were too clear, and the silence from the council was too loud. Somewhere out there, in the empty space where human ships used to fly, the galaxy was beginning to understand what it had lost. But it was not ready to admit it yet. The lights in the Grand Assembly Hall still glowed like artificial stars. The speeches were still made. The votes were still cast. Everything looked the same. But the coffee was gone from the human alcove, and nobody had remembered to turn off the small light above the empty chair where Danny Cole used to sit. 1 year after the vote, the thing that everyone had been afraid of, but nobody had said out loud, finally arrived. The Vreliki swarm came from beyond the mapped rim of the galaxy, from a region of space so far out that most species did not bother to name it. The Vreliki were not a civilization. They did not have cities, or governments, or art, or music. They were a hive species, billions of organisms moving as one, driven by a single biological need: consume, grow, and move forward. They did not negotiate because they had nothing to say. They did not make war because they did not think of it as war. They simply arrived at a world, stripped it of every usable resource, and moved on to the next. They had been a growing threat for 20 years. Every council intelligence briefing for the last decade had mentioned them. But the threat had always felt distant, manageable, because of two things that stood between the Vreliki and Council space. The first was a network of early warning sensor platforms scattered across the outer rim. These platforms could detect Vreliki movement months before the swarm reached inhabited space, giving the Council time to prepare and evacuate if necessary. The platforms were designed and built by the Human Defense Cooperation Office. Their power cores used a human-patented technology that was efficient, reliable, and completely unique. No other species had anything like it. The second was a rapid response tactical doctrine, a set of strategies for engaging the Vreliki in open space, using speed and coordination to break apart swarm formations before they could overwhelm a planet. This doctrine had been written by Captain Ethan Price, a human naval officer who had spent 6 years studying the Vreliki and running simulations. He had trained teams from 7 Council species in these tactics. He had been recalled to Earth with everyone else. 6 months after the humans left, the sensor network began to fail. The power cores needed maintenance that required human technical knowledge. Council engineers tried to service them and could not. They tried to build replacements, but the technology was not compatible. One by one the platforms went dark. The eyes that watched the rim closed, and nobody could open them again. The Council's military leadership knew this was a problem. They filed reports. They requested funding for alternative detection systems. The reports sat in committees. The funding was delayed. There were other priorities, other arguments, other votes. And then the Vreliki arrived. They hit 3 colony worlds in quick succession, 2 in the outer sectors, and 1 on the edge of Kreeth territory. The swarm descended like a living cloud. Millions of organisms swarming over the surface, consuming everything organic and mineral alike. The colonies had almost no warning, because the sensor platforms that should have given them months of lead time were dead and silent. The Council fleet responded, but it was slow. The Baltari sent their warships, which were powerful and heavily armed, but they were designed for a different kind of fight. Baltari naval tradition was built around formal engagements, 2 fleets facing each other in ordered lines, exchanging fire in disciplined volleys. The Vreliki did not fight like that. They came from every direction at once, in swirling, unpredictable patterns that changed every second. The Baltari captains tried to hold formation, and found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. The Kreeth refused to commit ships outside their own borders. Their fleet existed to defend Kreeth worlds, and nothing else. The Fenori had no real military at all. They watched the news feeds from their water-filled homes, and felt a fear they had no name for. 3 worlds fell. Millions of people, Kreeth, Baltari, and others, were evacuated in chaos. Some were not evacuated at all. Council President Valith Doan, a thin and careful politician from a species called the Asari, convened an emergency session. The Grand Assembly Hall was full, and for the first time in a long time, it was quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of fear. After hours of debate that produced no solutions, Valith Doan did what many had been thinking, but nobody had wanted to say. He sent a formal request to Earth. The message was addressed to President Laura Bennett and transmitted on the highest diplomatic channel. It requested that humanity re-engage with the Council, specifically to reactivate the sensor network, and provide tactical advisors for the fight against the Vreliki. The language was formal, but strained. It stopped short of an apology, but it carried the weight of desperation. The galaxy waited for a response. It came 3 days later. President Laura Bennett replied personally. The message was not long. It was written in the plain, direct style that humans used when they meant every word. She expressed sympathy for the Council's situation and for the people who had been affected by the Vreliki attacks. She offered humanitarian aid immediately, food shipments, medical supplies, and refugee support for displaced populations. She said that human cargo ships would begin delivering supplies within 2 weeks, no strings attached. But she declined the military request. Her words were careful. The people of Earth hold no grudge against the Galactic Council or any of its member species. We remember our time among you with gratitude and warmth. But we were told, by formal vote, that our nature was unwelcome at your table. Our willingness to fight, to protect, to stand in harm's way, these were listed among the reasons for our removal. We will not force ourselves where we are not wanted. We will not impose our way on those who have asked us to leave. We wish you only peace and safety, and we hope with all our hearts that you find both. The message was read aloud in the Grand Assembly Hall. When it was finished, nobody spoke for a very long time. It was not the response they had feared. They had feared anger, bitterness, demands, and conditions. What they received was worse. What they received was kindness. And kindness from someone you have wronged is the hardest thing in the universe to bear. Sci-Fi Realm broke the silence. She called the human response predictable emotional manipulation and urged the Council to develop its own solutions. But her voice did not carry the same authority it once had. The silver of her skin had gone slightly gray, and the delegates were not looking at her anymore. That same week, Korath Sel made a decision. He had been working on his dependency gap report for months, gathering data, checking numbers, verifying every claim twice. His superiors had told him to stop. He had not stopped. Now the report was finished, over 200 pages of clear, careful analysis, and he decided the Council needed to see it, whether it wanted to or not. He leaked it to the public information networks. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every species with access to a screen could read it. The data was staggering, and it was undeniable. In 12 months since the human departure, the Council had lost 14% of its deep space communication capacity, 9% of its medical research output, 22% of its border security effectiveness, and 100% of its Vreliki early warning capability. Every single number traced back to something a human had built, maintained, contributed, or organized. Not because humans were superior, but because they had a strange and stubborn habit of seeing a problem and just fixing it, without being asked, without seeking credit, without waiting for a committee to approve a budget. The report did not blame anyone. It did not argue for or against any policy. It simply laid out what had been lost and let the numbers speak for themselves. And the numbers said, "You made a mistake." On Earth, the report was read with quiet sadness. There was no celebration, no satisfaction. President Bennett issued no public statement about it. Danny Cole, who had returned to a small town in Vermont and was spending his days reading books and going for long walks, heard about it from a friend who called him on the phone. He listened, said, "I see," and then asked his friend if she had tried the new bakery on Main Street. The galaxy was beginning to crack open, and the light coming through was not comfortable. But it was honest, and sometimes honesty is where things start to heal. The dependency gap report burned through the galaxy like fire through dry grass. There was no stopping it, no containing it, no pretending it did not exist. Every news network on every world carried it. Analysts broke down the numbers. Opinion writers argued about what it meant. Ordinary citizens on dozens of planets read it and felt something shift inside them. A slow, uncomfortable realization that the comfortable order of things had been built, in part, on the backs of people they had sent away. On Baltari Prime, the reaction was the most painful. The Baltari were a proud species. They were large and strong and ancient, and they did not like to admit weakness. But Crimson Wasting did not care about pride. The disease was killing their children, and the drug that stopped it was running out. And the man who had made that drug, a quiet human named Sam Griffin, who used to eat lunch alone in the hospital cafeteria, and always left his lab door open so that anyone could come in and ask questions, was gone. Families gathered outside the council embassy on Baltari Prime. They did not shout or break things. They stood in silence, holding photographs of their children, and that silence was louder than any riot could have been. The images spread across every network in the galaxy. A Baltari elder named Gorath Ken, who had lost a granddaughter to crimson wasting 20 years ago, before Veracillin existed, and then watched his grandson survive because of it, stood before the crowd and spoke. His voice was deep and rough, and it carried the weight of a very old grief and a very new one. We did not ask the humans to build that medicine. They saw our children suffering, and they built an answer. We repaid them with exile. That is what we did. And now we stand here, holding pictures of the ones we may lose, and we wonder why the universe feels so cold. On Fenori, the trade guilds had finished counting their losses. The numbers were catastrophic. Without human escort corvettes protecting their shipping lanes, pirate raids had cost them billions in stolen cargo and damaged ships. Dozens of Fenori crew members had been injured. 3 were dead. The guilds, who funded a significant portion of the council's general budget, announced that they were suspending all financial contributions until the security situation was resolved. It was the first time any species had pulled funding from the council in over 1,000 years. 3 smaller species, the Tolani, the Jessic, and the Mirai, went further. They announced, jointly, that they were opening independent diplomatic channels with Earth, outside the Council framework. They did not ask permission, they simply did it. The Tolani ambassador, the one with large dark eyes who had spoken in humanity's defense during the original vote, gave a brief statement. We will not wait for this body to correct its error. Our people need help now, and we know where to find it. Inside the council, the political ground was shifting fast. Koroth Sel, the young Delvari diplomat who had leaked the report, was summoned before a disciplinary committee. He was expected to apologize and resign. Instead, he stood before the committee and said, I will accept whatever punishment this body decides. But the report is accurate. Every number is verified. If telling the truth is a crime, then I am guilty, and I will carry that guilt proudly. The committee could not agree on a punishment. Half of them privately agreed with him. He was sent back to his desk. Within days, a faction formed around Koroth Sel. 11 species joined. The Tolani, the Mirai, the Jessic, and 8 others who had been quietly unhappy since the vote. Together, they drafted a formal motion to invite humanity back to the council. But this time, not as associate members. They proposed full membership with permanent standing and veto power, the highest status any species could hold. Empress Sitha Vel blocked the motion. Under council rules, any resolution concerning membership could be delayed by a sitting empress or emperor for 1 full session cycle. She used this power without hesitation, calling the motion a surrender to sentimentality, and warning that it would set a dangerous precedent. But Sitha Vel's authority was fading. The Delvari delegation was fracturing. Younger Delvari diplomats were openly questioning her leadership. Her approval among her own people had dropped sharply since the report was published. She had built her political career on the idea that the council was stronger without humans. Every day, the evidence proved her wrong. The Vreliki took a 4th world. This time, it was a Delvari colony, a small agricultural settlement called Verat Sola, home to 200,000 Delvari civilians. The evacuation was messy and incomplete. 30,000 people were left behind. Sitha Vel was forced to go before the council and ask the Baltari fleet for direct military protection of Delvari space. It was the first time in living memory that the Delvari had asked another species for protection. The Baltari agreed, But their conditions were steep. They demanded trade concessions, access to Delvari mineral reserves, and a formal acknowledgement of Baltari military superiority. Sci-Fi accepted all of it. She had no choice. The balance of power in the council was collapsing, and everyone could see it. The structure that had held for thousands of years was bending under the weight of problems it had never learned to solve on its own, because it had never needed to. The humans had been solving them quietly, in the background, without asking for anything in return. On Earth, the situation was watched with a feeling that was hard to name. It was not satisfaction. Humans did not enjoy watching other people suffer, even people who had hurt them. President Laura Bennett held a meeting in her office with a small group of advisors. Among them were two people who understood the situation better than most. One was retired Captain Ethan Price, who had written the Vreliki tactical doctrine and trained council forces to use it. He was 58 now, teaching military history at a university in Virginia. He still had the sharp, focused look of a man who noticed everything. The other was Danny Cole, the former ambassador. He had been invited to the meeting, and he had come reluctantly, wearing a flannel shirt and looking like he would rather be anywhere else. He had been happy in Vermont. He had opened a small bookshop. He had a cat. He did not want to come back to politics. President Bennett asked them both the same question. What do we do? Ethan Price spoke first. From a military standpoint, I could reactivate the sensor network in a few weeks, if given a team and access. The tactical doctrine is still valid. The Vreliki have not changed. The Council's problem is not capability, it is coordination. They have the ships, they do not have the habit of working together. Danny Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They have to want us for what we are, Laura, not just for what we give them. If we go back now, because they are afraid, they will use us until the fear passes and then push us away again. That is not a partnership, that is a transaction." Bennett nodded. "So we wait. We wait," Danny agreed, "but we keep the door open." 3,000 light-years away, a young Talani diplomat named HFY boarded a ship heading for Earth. She carried no official mandate from the Council or from the Talani government. She carried a small bag with a change of clothes and a datapad containing Korath Cell's full report. She had read it 7 times. She arrived on Earth and went directly to the State Department building in Washington. She walked up to the front desk, small and wide-eyed and visibly nervous, and said, "My name is HFY. I am a citizen of Tolan. I have no authority and no official mission. I would like to speak with whoever is willing to listen." 20 minutes later, Deputy Secretary Megan Hall came down to the lobby. Megan was a tall woman with short brown hair and a direct way of looking at people that made most diplomats uncomfortable. She had been in government for 20 years, and she had a reputation for saying exactly what she thought at all times. She looked at HFY, who was about 3 feet tall and trembling slightly, and said, "You came a long way." "Yes," HFY said. "What do you want?" HFY took a breath. "I am not here to ask for your help. I know my people have no right to ask for anything. I am here to apologize. Not on behalf of the Council. I cannot speak for them. I am here to apologize for myself, and for every person who sat in that chamber and said nothing when they should have spoken." Megan Hall looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a political smile, but a real one. "Have you eaten?" Megan asked. "No," HFY said. "There is a good sandwich place around the corner. We will talk." They walked out of the building together into the afternoon sunlight. A tall human woman and a small alien diplomat, side by side, and for the first time in over a year, something that had been broken began, very carefully, to mend. 18 months after the vote that sent humanity away, the Galactic Council held an emergency session that would change everything. The Grand Assembly Hall was full. Every species was present. The air in the chamber felt heavy, charged with something that had been building for months. The artificial stars on the ceiling still glowed, but the room beneath them felt smaller than it used to, as if the walls had drawn inward while nobody was watching. The news was bad and getting worse. The Vreliki swarm had taken a seventh world. The medical crisis on Baltari Prime was deepening. Vericillin supplies were nearly gone, and children were dying at a rate not seen in 20 years. Pirate raids in Fenori space had become so common that some trade lanes had been abandoned entirely. The deep space communication network was failing in patches, leaving whole sectors unable to contact each other for days at a time. And 3 species had already begun talking to Earth on their own, outside the Council's authority, which meant the Council's authority was no longer something anyone took seriously. Korath Sel had spent the past weeks building a coalition. He was young, and he was not powerful, but he had something that mattered more than power in that moment. He had the truth, and people knew it. 11 species had already joined his faction. In the days before the emergency session, 5 more added their names quietly. Then, 3 more. Then, 2 more. When the session opened, a Baltari delegate named Vorath Gen stood and called for a vote of no confidence in Empress Scytha-Vel's leadership of the Council. Under Council rules, such a vote required support from at least 15 species to proceed. 21 raised their markers. Scytha-Vel stood in her alcove and watched the lights turn against her. Her skin, which once shifted with cool silver confidence, had gone a flat, dull gray. She did not speak. There was nothing to say that would change what was happening. The vote passed, and she was removed from her position, the first leader in the history of the Galactic Council to be dismissed in this way. Korath Sel was elected interim speaker. He accepted the role with visible reluctance and a short statement. I did not seek this. I sought only the truth. But if this body needs someone to speak it, I will try. His first act was not what anyone expected. He did not send politicians to Earth. He did not send generals or diplomats or negotiators. He sent ordinary people. He assembled a delegation of citizens from across the Council. Baltari parents whose children had been saved by Vericillin before the supply ran out. Parents who remembered Sam Griffin's face and the way he used to carry lollipops in his lab coat pocket for the young patients. Fenori merchants who remembered the human escort pilots by name, who had shared meals with them during long convoy runs across empty space. Kreeth scientists who had co-authored research papers with human colleagues, and still kept those papers pinned to their office walls. Tolani musicians, who had once performed alongside a human guitarist named Caleb North at a cultural festival on Verath Prime, and who still remembered the way the audience, dozens of species, all different, all strange to each other, had stood together and listened to the music, and felt for a few minutes like one people. Reshki Vo, the young Tolani diplomat who had gone to Earth alone and uninvited, was asked to lead the delegation. She agreed. They arrived on Earth on a Tuesday morning, landing at a small spaceport outside Washington. There was no grand ceremony, no flags, no banners, no speeches on the runway. Megan Hall was there to meet them, wearing a simple coat and carrying an umbrella because it was raining. She shook Reshki's hand, nodded to the others, and said, "Welcome. We have a lot to show you." Over the next week, the delegation was taken across Earth, not to military bases or government buildings, but to the places where humans actually lived. They visited a hospital in Chicago, where doctors were treating patients from 4 different species, refugees who had arrived from the Vreliki-affected sectors. They visited a school in a small town in Oregon, where children were learning about alien biology as part of their regular science class, not because anyone had told them to, but because their teacher thought it was important. They visited a community center in Houston, where retired Captain Ethan Price was teaching a weekend class on interstellar navigation to a group of teenagers who wanted to be pilots. They visited Danny Cole's bookshop in Vermont. It was a small place on a quiet street, with creaky wooden floors and a cat sleeping on the counter. Danny made them tea and showed them around. The Baltari delegate had to duck to get through the door. The Fenori delegate, who was visiting in a portable water suit, accidentally knocked over a shelf of paperbacks. Danny picked them up without complaint and said, "Don't worry about it. Books are tough." They sat together in the shop while rain hit the windows, and they talked. Not about politics or treaties or military alliances. They talked about small things, about children and food and music and the way it felt to look up at the stars and wonder who else was looking back. The delegation returned to Verath Prime. Reshki Vo addressed the full council. She did not give a long speech. She said, "They are not angry. They are not waiting for us to suffer enough to earn their return. They are simply living, as they have always lived, helping whoever walks through their door. We sent them away, and they responded by treating our refugees with kindness. I do not know what we did to deserve that. I do not think we did anything to deserve it. But that is the point. They do not keep score." The full council voted on the invitation to bring humanity back as full members with permanent standing. The vote was not close. It was unanimous. All 41 remaining species voted yes. Not one marker stayed dark. When word reached Earth, President Laura Bennett called Danny Cole. He was in his bookshop, restocking shelves. "Danny," she said, "they want you back." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Will you go?" she asked. He looked around his shop. He looked at the cat, who was asleep again. He looked at the rain on the window. "Yes," he said, "I will go. Because that is what humans do. When someone needs them, they show up. Even if it hurts, even if it is not fair, even if they have every right to say no, they show up, because leaving people alone with their pain is something they have never been able to do." Danny Cole returned to Verath Prime as ambassador. His alcove had been moved from the far edge of the chamber to the center. He walked in, set his coffee cup on the desk, and sat down as if he had never left. Captain Ethan Price came out of retirement. He took a small team to the Outer Rim and reactivated the sensor network in 3 weeks. The Vreliki were detected, tracked, and engaged using the tactical doctrine he had written years ago. The Council fleet, this time coordinated by human advisors who knew how to make different species fight as one, broke the swarm apart over the course of 2 months. It was not easy. People were lost, but the advance was stopped. Sam Griffin returned to Baltari Prime. He walked into his old lab, which had been left exactly as he had left it, and he found his Baltari research team waiting for him. They had not given up. They had been trying every day for over a year to crack the final synthesis step. Sam hugged each of them, which startled them because Baltari were not used to being hugged by someone half their size. Then he rolled up his sleeves and finished the training. The first new batch of Vericillin was produced within a month. Katie Morgan went back to Orathon 4. She found her atmospheric scrubbers in terrible condition and her garden completely overgrown. She fixed the scrubbers in 2 days, muttering the entire time about people who did not read her maintenance logs. Then she replanted her garden. At the first full session of the restored council, Korath Sel took the podium. The chamber was full and quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not fear, not tension, but attention. The kind of silence that means people are ready to listen. He read into the record a new amendment to the council charter. He called it the Cole Provision, named after the man who had left without anger and returned without conditions. It stated, "No species shall be expelled from this body for the nature of its being. Contribution is not currency. Presence is not a privilege to be revoked. The strength of this council has never come from the sameness of its members, but from their differences. We are whole not when we agree on everything, but when we stand together anyway." The amendment passed without opposition. Danny Cole, sitting in the human alcove at the center of the chamber, listened as his name was read into the permanent record of the Galactic Council. He did not clap. He did not stand. He did not make a speech. He picked up his coffee cup, which was warm this time, and took a sip. Beside him, a young aide leaned over and whispered, "How does it feel, sir?" Danny thought about it for a moment. He thought about the vote that had sent them away, and the long, quiet months in Vermont, and the rain on his bookshop window, and the faces of the delegation who had come to Earth with nothing but an apology and a hope. "It feels like home," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, the Grand Assembly Hall on Verath Prime smelled like coffee again. The Grand Assembly Hall on Verath Prime was the largest room ever built by any species in the known galaxy. Its ceiling curved upward like the inside of a shell, covered in lights that were meant to look like the stars of every homeworld represented below. 42 species sat in their assigned alcoves, arranged in a wide circle around a central platform where speakers could address the full council. The room smelled different depending on where you stood. Near the Fenori section, it smelled like salt water. Near the Creeth, it smelled like dry leaves and warm soil. Near the human section, which sat at the far edge of the chamber in a modest alcove with simple chairs, it smelled like coffee, because the humans always brought coffee. Ambassador Danny Cole sat in the front row of that alcove. He was a man in his early 50s, with gray at his temples and calm brown eyes. He wore a plain dark suit, no medals, no decorations. He had been the human ambassador to the Galactic Council for 9 years, and in all that time, he had never once raised his voice in the chamber. He did not raise it now, even though he already knew what was about to happen. The Dvelvari Empress, Sci-Fi Vel, stood on the central platform. She was tall, almost 8 feet, with smooth, pale skin that shifted color with her mood. Right now, it was a cool silver, which meant she was pleased with herself. Her voice filled the hall without effort. "For 60 years, humanity has held associate membership in this council," she said. "In that time, they have proven themselves to be unstable, aggressive, and culturally incompatible with the standards of civilized cooperation. Their history is soaked in blood. Their species spent thousands of years killing each other before they even reached the stars. They refuse to fully disarm their military fleet. They maintain unapproved colonies outside council-regulated space. And they have an unsettling habit of forming emotional attachments to species that did not ask for such bonds." She paused and let her gaze sweep across the chamber. Several delegations nodded. The insectoid Creeth clicked their mandibles in agreement. The towering Baltari, who stood nearly 10 feet tall and had skin like gray stone, remained still but did not object. The aquatic Fenori, watching through the transparent walls of their water-filled enclosure, bubbled softly among themselves. "I propose Resolution 7714, Sci-Fi continued. "The formal revocation of humanity's associate membership and their full withdrawal from all council systems, programs, and cooperative agreements." Danny Cole closed his eyes for a moment. He had called Earth the night before and spoken with President Laura Bennett. She had been quiet on the line for a long time. Then she had said, "If it comes to a vote, let it come. Do not beg, Danny. That is not who we are." The floor was opened for discussion. A few species spoke in humanity's defense. The Talani ambassador, a small being with large dark eyes and a gentle voice, reminded the chamber that human doctors had helped end a plague on her homeworld. The Murai delegate, whose people were engineers by nature, praised the reliability of human-built deep space relay beacons. But their voices were soft, and the chamber was large, and the voices in favor of the resolution were louder. When it was his turn, Danny Cole stood. He straightened his jacket, and walked to the central platform. He looked small there, surrounded by all that empty space and all those alien eyes. "I will not take much of your time," he said. His voice was steady and quiet, and the translation systems carried it to every alcove. "In 60 years, humanity has contributed medical research that saved lives across 9 species. We have provided emergency aid to 14 worlds struck by natural disaster. We have shared deep space exploration data freely and without cost. We have helped negotiate peaceful solutions to 7 border conflicts. And in all that time, not once has a human ship fired on a council species. Not once." He paused. The hall was silent. "We are not perfect," he said. "We know our history. We carry it with us every day, not as a source of pride, but as a reminder of what we are capable of when we forget to be kind. But we came here in good faith. We gave what we had. We asked for nothing in return, except the chance to be part of something larger than ourselves." He looked at Sithavel. She met his gaze with cool indifference. "If this body decides we are not welcome," Danny said, "we will accept that decision. We will leave quietly, and we will leave behind no anger. But I ask you, all of you, to remember this moment. Not because I want you to feel guilt, but because I want you to understand what you are choosing to lose." He returned to his seat. A few delegates shifted uncomfortably, but the moment passed. The vote was called. Each species cast their decision through the light system. Blue for yes, amber for no. The lights blinked on one by one. Blue, blue, amber, blue, blue, amber, blue. Danny counted them without expression. The final count was 31-11. The resolution passed. Sithavel announced the result with barely hidden satisfaction. "Humanity's membership is hereby revoked. The withdrawal period is set at 90 standard days." Danny Cole nodded. He did not argue. He did not protest. He picked up his coffee cup, which was now cold, and transmitted the result to Earth on his personal device. The message was short. Resolution passed, 31-11, awaiting instructions. The response came within hours, directly from President Laura Bennett's office. It was also short. Understood. Begin withdrawal protocol. Leave nothing behind but goodwill. And so it began. Over the next several weeks, humans started leaving. They closed their embassies and packed their things into boxes. They shut down their offices on Verath Prime and took down the small photographs and personal items that had made those offices feel like home. They recalled their doctors from interspecies medical stations, where some of them had worked for decades and had made friends they would never see again. They pulled their engineers from joint infrastructure projects, handing over detailed notes and maintenance logs to whoever would take them. They withdrew their teachers from cultural exchange academies, saying goodbye to students who did not understand why they had to go. They decommissioned the deep space relay beacons they had built and maintained at their own cost. They powered down the sensor platforms along the outer rim. They packed up the small clinic on Baltari Prime, where a pharmacologist named Sam Griffin had spent 12 years developing a drug that saved children from a terrible disease. They did all of this without protest, without sabotage, without a single angry message broadcast across the networks. They shook hands with those who would shake hands with them. They said thank you to those who had been kind. And then they boarded their ships and flew home. The council watched them go with a sense of quiet relief. A few delegates felt something they could not quite name. A small, cold feeling in the chest, like a room that had suddenly become too empty. But most were satisfied. Sithavel declared it a new era of stability. Danny Cole, sitting in the passenger cabin of the last human transport to leave Verath Prime, looked out the window as the station shrank behind him. He held his cold coffee cup in both hands and said nothing. There was nothing left to say.